everyone, Nicole Duckling, Technical Agronomist for DeKalb and Asgrow in Eastern Iowa. I want to take a little bit of time today to look back to what we experienced this spring, look at what's going on right now, and look forward to what I expect to be seeing here in the next, month, 10 days, whatever happens next. So, looking back on temperature and moisture for the months of April and May. Departure from normal, we were cooler and we were drier than what we typically see. And really, things went in the ground really well. And I think a great evidence of that point is look at how many waterways got seeded. Usually we don't have time for that kind of stuff. And they don't take anyway because we get a big washing rain that just runs a ravine down the middle. But waterways took really well because we were drier than normal. But on the flip side, we were also cooler than normal. So when we think about the very middle of April, we got cold rain, the temperatures were cold, and then things dried out. But they didn't warm up under the ground. So things dried up right around the 18th and 19th, but our soil temperatures were still pretty cool. We went ahead and planted in that window, and then we got kind of like a quarter to a half an inch of warm rain, a perfect rain on planted seeds that following week. Who could ask for more? I could. And do you know why? Because that warm rain got those seedlings off to a great start. And then the first week of May showed up and just put the kiboshes to it, which is really unfortunate because we had a lot of corn go into the ground that last week of April, get off to a good start, and then hit that cold window that first week of May. So I am seeing a fair amount of chilling injury that was reducing our stands. Now, when we think about chilling injury, a lot of times you want to think about that the corkscrew mesocotyls and leafing out underground, but it doesn't always present that way. In a lot of cases, much of the chilling injury that I was seeing was presented as a seed that would send a radicle but not a coleoptile, or a seed that would do a coleoptile but not a radicle. I got numerous calls where they would say, it's just sitting in the ground, it never germinated. But when we pulled it up and looked, it did germinate, it was just missing an essential part. Because when it gets that cold shock to it right away, it gets all sorts of confused and doesn't know what it's supposed to do, so it does it wrong. So that's one of the things that happened because of the cold. Now because of the dry, there was a fair amount of anhydrous burn as well as starter burn. So when it comes to anhydrous applications, it's not about days from application to planting, it's about the amount of moisture that it takes to mellow out and rebalance that pH. If we don't have the moisture to make that happen, then we still have a very high pH. If we get corn sitting on top of that anhydrous row, you're gonna have burnt off roots. When it comes to starters are going to have some sort of salt load in it. The higher the salt load, so say like potash or nitrogen, those have much higher salt loads than some of the other fertilizers, the more at risk you are. Added to that, not a whole lot of water to help dilute that salt. So we didn't have a whole lot of rain, we were dry. And if you're going to put it into sandier soils, you are at much higher risk for getting salt injury on those planted seeds. But now I'm going to switch gears and talk about the issues that we got because it was cold and wet. After I just told you about the issues that we got because it was dry, in the same breath I'm going to tell you about the issues because we were wet. So when I overlaid our temperature charts and the precipitation over top of it. And what's giving us issues that are typically present in a cool and wet environment, such as Pythium or Fusarium, is that it needs to be cool and wet. And we weren't. But when I look at the overlay of our precipitation and our temperature, our cold temperatures were paired with rain. And then not only that, but a lot of that rain, Pythium especially likes it when you get a saturating rain between germination and emergence. And we had that. And when we had cold temperatures, that's when we got our precipitation. Especially when you think about the late April, early May precipitation, and then it was cold after that. So we didn't get a whole lot of rain, but it never had the opportunity to dry out because it was so cold. So that seed was sitting in the soil for a month, so we tried to starve it, and then when it finally came to the surface and didn't need the seed anymore, it was cloudy. So we continued to try and starve it. And then not only that, but the soils were cold and wet, and then we didn't have a whole lot of phosphorus mineralization, so then we were also low on phosphorus, and so we were also seeing purple plants. So we tried really, really hard to kill this crop, but Mother Nature, we got ya. So the last thing I'm going to touch on for what happened earlier this spring is secondary. Something else that I've been seeing a fair amount of this year has been secondary pest feeding, primarily grubs and wireworms. Now, grubs and wireworms, they're kind of hard to detect or really notice if they're making a difference or not, because in many cases they won't outright kill the plant. So in the case of wireworm injury, again, doesn't outright kill the plant. What a wireworm does is below the soil surface, he will bore a hole through the growing plate in a lot of cases. So you'll end up with these plants that they almost kind of look like they got ran over by a sprayer. But when it bores through the growing point, it essentially splits it and makes more than one growing point. So right here, we have the original plant and then what looks like tillers coming off the side. It may also just be a plant that looks smaller than its neighbors. So again, while it's not outright killing these plants, it is going to impact our overall yield because we're reducing our viable ear count. So instead of reducing our stand count, it has reduced our ear count and it's making a weed. With the grubs, again, it's going to decrease the overall growing capacity of that young seedling. In addition to decreasing our ear count, if a plant may be getting fed on it but then gets a little bit of insecticide and dies, that plant is now open to infections primarily by fusarium and pythium. So what about control if we see that we have an issue? Well, when it comes to wireworms, they're a little special because those are a 7-year pest, meaning that they will stay as a larva, as the wireworm, between 4 to 7 years before it emerges as a click beetle. So if you have a known issue, it is there. So if you want to plant later, make sure that our soils are warmed up and those pests leave, you can do that. However, in a lot of cases, many guys will just go and put a soil applied insecticide in there to help with the seed applied insecticide, because the seed treatments really are only designed to last for about 3 to 4 weeks. As you look across my territory from down in the south on Highway 80 up to the Minnesota border, you're going to see a lot of different stages. And that means that my calls on ugly duckling syndrome or just yellow gross looking corn down south, I'm done with. Up north, they're starting on. So there's going to be a couple of different reasons for this ugly duckling syndrome, and the first one being temperature, root development, and plant development. So when we think about the fact that these plants didn't have much for a nodal root system until about V5, this plant's V7. It's been out of the ground a little bit, so it looks a little wilty. But those nutrients, especially when you're in an anhydrous-only field, that nitrogen is in the ammonium form, and the bulk of it is positionally unavailable. So we have to wait for our roots to get to a point where they're growing far enough, there's enough growth on there that they can access those nutrients. Next one being temperature. If we have cold soils, the nitrogen isn't mineralizing in the soil, and neither is the phosphorus. So there we're missing 2 very key ingredients for green plants. Another one is going to be residue. Again, we had a late harvest. There's a lot of residue sitting out here that didn't really break down a whole lot, so then it didn't release the nutrients. Not only that, but when we think about the residue sitting on top of the soil, we also had a lot of subtle variabilities in the temperatures of the soil, which is going to affect how quickly those seeds are growing and then how quickly we're getting mineralization of the nutrients in the soil. So that's what we've seen. We're finally getting through ugly duckling syndrome. What are we looking for the future? So right now I'm thinking disease, and I'm also thinking temperature and moisture. So on the disease front, we just had a tropical depression pass through. It was cool, it was wet. Guess what likes it cool and wet? Tar spot. So unlike something like gray leaf spot, which is gonna wait for the tassels to come out to infect it, tar spot can infect some of this immature corn. So it likes it cool and wet, so I'm gonna be on the lookout for that one. Another one is going to be Physoderma brown spot. So it needs free water, usually sitting in that whirl, to get that infection. Now, it's not an absolute indicator that says you're gonna get the node breakage, but then we at least know that it's in the field. So we've got one of the little legs of the disease triangle there sitting there for us. Next thing, corn rootworm. Apparently, I don't stay up this late, so I haven't seen them, but I saw on Twitter that we've got lightning bugs starting out, okay? Lightning bugs and rootworm hatch take about the same number of GDUs, so when we see the lightning bugs, those are going to start hatching, so we'll also be digging roots, looking for those rootworm larvae, and trying to check for rootworm damage. Another thing is temperature. It was cool and weak last week. It's going to be pretty hot. There's some chances for some rain, so that would help a little bit. But this spring, I did see a fair amount of sidewall compaction. Whether it worked up well or not, when you get snow in April, it really makes it tough to get things dried out well underneath, especially in some of these vertical till tools. So we've got a fair amount of sidewall compaction. Corn that is already past V6, you're probably going to be okay. But if your corn's not quite to V6, maybe it was a little tacky when you planted, or underneath wasn't quite completely dried out yet. If we get this really hot and dry weather in this next week or so, we could potentially be seeing some rootless corn syndrome. So keep an eye out for that. And as always, if you have questions, call, text, or email.